One of my most popular series is System Agnostic classes, where I look into various RPG classes independent of their system and setting. And by popular, I mean, whenever I upload one of those, people hit me up and go, "Hell yeah, this is great content, keep it up." In terms of views, they don't do so good. And for a while now, I wanted to do the same thing with like RPG races, but I always thought that was a bit too much of a hay barn to throw a torch into. Look, I'm fine picking fights with mechanics nerds, but even suggesting that a fictional concept that is completely arbitrary in every way, shape, and form is different than what the correct definition of that thing is, will summon the literature nerds. Literature nerds are vicious. But you know what? Fight me. Come at me, fucking fight me. Shout out to Art Monzo and PO from the Discord server who reminded me that I wanted to do this, and so now I am doing it. And so the first race we are going to take a look at today is species? I mean, like, seriously, what do we call the series? Like, that is a genuine question. Because apparently there's a lot of people who have a bit of a problem with calling fantasy races, and I'm gonna be completely honest with you, I kind of see why. But I am also a very firm believer in not letting American sensibilities dictate the way that the entire world speaks and communicates around concepts. So let's talk about words. What does race mean? I've talked about this before in a very, very different type of video. Race is not a scientific term. It isn't something that scientists use to describe anything. What it tends to be is a classification of people based on superficial phenotypical traits, usually skin color, and then those people are all grouped together and have certain cultural, behavioral, psychological attributes ascribed to them. This is why people say race is a social construct, even though it is based on real, actual physical characteristics. It's a lot of ideas just attached to something that really is, you know, not all that indicative of what a person is. Like, you're lumping in a suit and tie wearing businessman from Lagos with a Hadzabe hunter-gatherer from the other side of the continent. They have pretty much nothing in common. It's not a useful category to describe people by. Not to mention, it was for a long time used for a lot of pseudoscientific and extremely racist bullshit. And the thing is, in fantasy settings, the different races are actually very much not social constructs. They are very biologically distinct. A term that is used by scientists is ethnicity, but there we find very quickly that you can't really draw a clear line between different ethnicities all that easily. It's also kind of a socially constructed concept. It's a very blurry concept. Also doesn't describe any biological differences. Ethnicity is similar to race in that it is ultimately arbitrary, but aside from just lumping people together based on superficial physical characteristics, it also groups them based on history, geographic region that they inhabit, religion, cultural values. The big difference is really that with ethnicity, the group of people that are an ethnicity describe themselves as such. They self-identify as an ethnicity. And depending on how that works and how other people identify other people of that same ethnicity, you could have certain cultural regions in the world, especially here in the West, where you can look at a person and, like, they have a completely different ethnicity, essentially, than what you would at first guess by looking purely at, say, their skin color. For instance, I don't really care if you were born in Ghana and all of your ancestors were also born in Ghana and you have a very long family history in Ghana. If you live in Germany, you speak the language reasonably well and you self-identify as being German, to me, you are ethnically German, because historically, what is ethnically German has been defined by the language and by the self-identifying as a nation over the feudalist rulers of the era. You don't even need citizenship, in my view. Now, other people might disagree with this, and they're not necessarily wrong. It is ultimately a social construct, and every single person's standards of what is and what is not ethnically something can differ vastly. But now we say we have a fantasy setting where a human is living among elves, and they pronounce him an elf. he's still gonna live until he's 80 and then die. Now, this could be for an individual character an entirely interesting, cool plot point, whatever, having that whole thing be a verification of what, maybe there's some kind of like fantasy otherkin, who knows. But if you open up the player's guide and you skip to the section where you have the biologically distinct groups of people that you can select from, and the social construct is all that you get, you will be a little disappointed. That's not what you meant when you were looking into that. Which leads me to one of the most fundamental problems with all of this. Language is meant to be used to communicate. And if you use a word where the other person has pretty much no chance of understanding what you mean by that word, you are using the wrong word. In the context of RPGs, race is a word that everybody knows. Like, people who play RPGs, when you say race to them, even if they disagree with the fundamental concept, they know what you mean. Communication has happened successfully. But it's not the only word that we could use where everyone would know what is meant. We could also use the word species. It's very fitting. And if you want to round back to the science, there have been distinct human species over the course of prehistory, most prominently the Neanderthals. Now, technically, the definition of species is when you have two animals, different animals, that cannot produce fertile offspring. So either you have something like a house cat and a jellyfish who can't produce offspring because they're completely biologically incompatible, or you could have a tiger and a lion who might produce a liger, which is a really badass animal, but which is also infertile. Of course, the actual reality of this is a lot more complicated. Sometimes happens that a chimeric creature like a liger is actually fertile. Usually they can only then have offspring with one of the two parent species, but it does happen. And what if you have just people who can't have kids? That doesn't mean they're of different species. And who knows, maybe through genetic engineering we will all finally have the pet jellyfish house cat that we all dreamed of as kids. And if we look at modern human populations, we see a lot of DNA from a lot of prehistoric humanoids, because apparently there was interbreeding, and apparently they could integrate into the greater population of Homo sapiens sapiens over time. Much like everything in science, contrary to popular belief, it's a lot fuzzier than you might assume. So even if we go ahead and say we have different species like orcs, elves, humans, dwarves, it's not at all unreasonable that they could have offspring with each other. So like the half elves, half orcs, half dwarves. It's possible, scientifically, that offspring would usually be infertile, which would explain why they don't have like a stable population of half elves. But that doesn't need to be the case. Not only have I, for instance, experimented in fiction extensively with stable, like, half-orc populations, it's also a land of make-believe. Not only do you not have to stick to the science, you also have magic. And you can just say, oh, look, anything is possible. That's entirely justified. So maybe the jellyfish house cat is viable after all. Any sort of scientific nomenclature that you would use to name it scientifically, it's really just preference. And I've already said this, language is there to communicate. What we mean is biologically distinct character options, and species for this is certainly an apt word. The main reason I personally don't really like to use it in fantasy is because it sounds very science fiction-y. It kind of takes me out of the notion of immersion. And I'm aware that there are some people who have decided that using the word race is incorrect to describe this concept, but the thing is, you cannot change how language is used prescriptively. That doesn't work. Maybe using species instead of race is going to stick. It's entirely possible that zeitgeist will change, and then people will use it differently. The idea of what it means in people's heads will change over time as well. Feels wrong to me now, maybe in 10 years it won't. Or maybe it's going to end up like most of the attempts to change language prescriptively, which is nowhere, and in 100 years people are still gonna say race to describe biologically distinct character options for like fantasy people. I should name this video In Defense of Race. That's gonna attract the right kind of people. At the same time, I'm not gonna spurg out at you for using the word species. Instead, I know what you mean when you say that. You know what I mean when I say that. Communication has happened. The purpose of words has been fulfilled. So now let's talk about what it actually is. I am actually very fond of the notion of fantasy races as being very biologically distinct groups, because that isn't something we have in the real world. They are just built different. Elves just live 1,000 years. This is not a cultural practice. This is a biological reality for them. Dwarves are just short. This is not a cultural practice, this is a biological reality for them. Orcs just have a short temper and are prone to violence. This is not a cultural practice, this is just a biological reality for them. But wait, hang on. Is it? There's something that a lot of people get very irritated with, and I find it's like naive. They're okay with biological differences in any organ of the body, but when it comes to the brain, that shit is untouchable. Brains vary vastly from individual human to individual human. They're more complex than the entire rest of the body put together. You could even say that they're more complex than the entire rest of the universe put together if you take out all the other brains. Biologically distinct species have brains that are different. You think cows eat grass all day because they chose that over becoming like a composer, and every single cow in the history of ever has chosen to eat grass instead of becoming a composer? Now, of course, I know why people get bothered by this in a very Jesus Christ, get out of your own head kind of way. If you want to play your fantasy races without any mind differences, go ahead. It's your setting. I'm not gonna force you to do anything. Just don't tell other people what they have to do. I personally don't like the orcs that are on average stupider than humans. That's not something that I prefer. I prefer to give them other psychological traits, like, for instance, having a shorter temper, they tend to be more prone to violence, which some of that might actually be a cultural practice. Who knows? These things are very entangled with each other. Although, here's a thing that I always find odd. I've yet to see anyone complain that elves are smarter than humans on average. The important thing, I think, is that how your races work does not become prescriptive to the individual character. Even if it's true that in your setting, goblins are just kind of dumb. That's entirely reasonable as an assumption. You don't play the race of goblins. You play a individual goblin, one person, and that person might be a genius. They could be a powerful wizard. Or if, say, your dwarves are non-magical, but a player really wants to play a dwarf that is magical, you could have him be the exception to that rule. This, of course, comes with consequences for that individual character. There's going to be a lot of interesting conflict with the background to play with, maybe some ostracization, prejudice, that kind of stuff, if this is the kind of theme that your table wants to explore. What you can't do is go, no, your dwarf has to hate elves. See, one thing that has always bothered me about fantasy races is that they have a tendency to equate the biology and the culture, which is kind of weird to me. Maybe this is because I grew up with, like, the Dark Eye and the Elder Scrolls orcs, but whenever I see, like, a Reddit post or a tweet of somebody going, did you know that orcs are actually, they can be complex and they don't all have to be exclusively raiders with no culture all of the time? I always go like, why would you ever have assumed that that is the case? The whole roving band of raiders thing that a lot of goblinoids tend to share, in my mind, has always been a cultural practice. And it's not even entirely fictitious, like there's real world precedent for this. You ever hear about the Vikings? they had that as a cultural practice. They existed for a lot longer than they had that as a cultural practice. And even the guys who did the raiding would, after the raid was over, go back home to their 9-to-5 day jobs as a cybersecurity consultant for the Jarl. To be fair though, I would really love to see like a seafaring raider culture for orcs. I think that would be really cool. But of course your fantasy race isn't synonymous with your culture. That's insane. Now if we're talking maybe about small populations, sure, potentially, but also like how are they surviving without it basically just being incest? There is the concept of subraces, which is a word that actually has always made me cringe a little bit. A lot of games don't have the concept of subraces or something related to it, but a lot of the big ones do. And it always struck me that sometimes it's biological differences, and sometimes it's cultural differences. And you know, depending on how your individual system works and how your world works, people should be able to assemble these even if you're using the big ones. But ideally, I would have it opened up like this. Species is the biological bit. Now, I say biological, it can also be magical if, like, the species is a magical being, like an elemental, or they have an intuitive, inherent grasp of, you know, a certain thing that is a certain kind of magic. It's the ingrained baseline traits that like 99% of the people of that race have. This is how old they get, the density of their bones, whether they have infrared vision, that kind of stuff. But as we can see in humans, every species is gonna have some level of variance in phenotypical traits and how they are expressed. That this doesn't mean like a fundamental genetic difference, as we all understand, because we have a grasp of basic genetics. But with fantasy races, that can be a lot more specific and a lot more pronounced, which is how we come to the concept of fantasy ethnicities. You have your elves, but you also have your dark elves, which have gray skin, and they live underground, and they have a very good dark vision, and they're very photosensitive. Keep in mind that the category of ethnicity here only becomes relevant if there's like significant differences that are maintained across a certain population, and also that the term ethnicity is not really interchangeable with the way that we define ethnicity as humans. Like, you can put them in as flavor, but if your only difference is gonna be the skin color and not even like any different stats, you might as well like not use them. And finally, you have culture, which represents all the socially constructed stuff that doesn't actually relate back to any sort of biological reality, or at least only does so over like 5 corners. If you have a desert-based culture, this is where you put the knows how to survive in the desert bonus. If it's a culture where everyone learns certain kinds of magic in primary school, this is where you put that. The key thing is that though usually in any given culture, one particular species and ethnicity will be the vast majority of people, it's not entirely uncommon to have someone who isn't that be in the same culture. A lizard man who grew up in a troll culture will have adopted the cultural practices of that troll culture. They'd be an unusual character facing a lot of unique individual challenges, but that's the kind of stuff that role-playing is about. If you are going to distinguish the various subgroups of your races, usually culture is the place where you do that. So for instance, you have your raider orcs who live in the deep forest wilderness, and they have a complex political structure of warlords and clans. But you have a different orc culture, same biological beings, but they live in like a very hostile place up in the mountains. They're very proud that they are successful agrarians down there, just raising hardy crops and tough beasts. Then you have the orcs that crowd around the desert oases with their silk turbans who like to smoke hookah. They have a lot of powerful illusionists, and they're very passionate and forceful negotiators. Always keep in mind that any individual character can be anything from a paragon of their culture to someone who is radically different from it. Every culture is a group of people, and every group of people has a broad range of opinions and values and social norms that they deem appropriate or inappropriate. A character's culture should influence who they are, but it should not be the defining characteristic of their personality. You should look at what does culture X usually believe about Y, and then also think, what does my character believe about that? And that really is what it all boils down to, is you can define all of these things in whatever way that you want to use them, so long as you manage to communicate with the people that you are playing with. RPGs, like pretty much all fiction, are there to explore ideas, and if there's certain ideas you want to explore as a group, I can't really think of a better place to do that. If you want a stratified, isolationist world where meeting a different race is almost, like, incredibly unlikely, you can do that. If you want a super cosmopolitan world where every kind of being can be found pretty much anywhere, you can also do that. In a sci-fi setting that I have, people can change their races. They can just make the choice to get a new one, even though they do represent very real biological characteristics. Also, I have named them creeds, because that has a better feel to it in this particular context. It takes a while to change your entire body through what is effectively like gene therapy, but also the people in this setting are like biologically immortal, essentially, so 10 years, it's 10 years, but it's also on the grand scale of things not necessarily a gigantic time investment. So consider what I think about whether you like it, and then find your own way. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, I'm really glad that my camera didn't die.